Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. The episode you're about to listen to is an interview on the book of Leviticus. This is the third book of the Pentateuch, or the third book of the Old Testament, depending on your tradition. And I think, as we'll discuss in this interview, it's probably one of the least loved and least read books, either in the Christian or in Jewish study of Scripture. But it's something I found really interesting recently, and I came to it because I've recently really been reading about sacrificial systems and their internal logic and the types of theology that they imply, and I've just found that a really fascinating topic. Instead of thinking, oh, this is weird, or why would people do that, to actually think, well, no, why would people do this? Why was this meaningful for people? What vision of the world did it imply? So I got really lucky with my interviewee for this episode. Really my first choice person to come on, and he kindly agreed, Professor Joel Baden, who's someone... If you're watching this on YouTube, he has a lot of other content on YouTube, other interviews. He's also done a number of courses. He's done some courses you can just do for free online on Genesis and Exodus. So I guess in some ways this is like a mini sequel to that, or perhaps like a trailer for the full sequel. I think he will teach a full course on Leviticus later this year or next, I'm not quite sure. So anyway, Professor Joel Baden is Professor of the Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School. He works in that field with special attention to the literary history of the Pentateuch, and is the author most recently of the Book of Exodus, a biography with Princeton University Press in 2019. His other books include J.E. and the Redaction of the Pentateuch, the Composition of the Pentateuch, Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis, The Promise to the Patriarchs, The Historical David, The Real Life of an Invented Hero, Reconceiving Infertility, Biblical Perspectives on Procreation and Childlessness, and Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby. So, I usually say I think these interviews speak for themselves. For this one, because, like I say, I've been kind of nerding out on this stuff a bit recently, there perhaps is a tiny bit of knowledge just assumed in the interview, which I sort of apologise for. I generally try to make sure everything's understood by any audience. What I'm going to do for this one is, hopefully you can just watch it and appreciate it on its own terms, but I'm going to link to two other interviews, both on the channel Digital Hammurabi, which I really recommend if you don't follow them already. One with Joel Baden on the documentary hypothesis, which we cover very briefly here, but essentially that's how the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, came to be put together. We give a very brief overview here, but if you want to really get into that, I'll link to that below. And in fact, I'm going to discuss the documentary hypothesis in more detail in an upcoming episode. But if you want more information on that, check it out. I'll also link to another interview about how the authors of the Old Testament conceived of God physically. In other words, put simply, what did God look like? Which again, we touch on briefly in this. But if you do want to sort of explore that topic in a lot more depth, again, links in the description below, along with links to my podcast and my Patreon. As some of you will be aware, I'm doing this one in both video and the usual audio only. I don't think it makes a huge difference, honestly, for the interviews. I am going to have like a video essay coming out. I've been saying soon for a while. These things, it turns out, are quite a lot of work. But I just wanted to give the audience more options. So for guests who are down to do a video, I've been releasing it both ways. So if you're listening to this on audio and you want to see the video, I'll link to that in the podcast's show notes. So, apart from that, let's get started. Apart from, as always, to thank my Patreons. Had a few more people signing up to sponsor the show this week, which is terrific. I don't do any advertisements at all on this channel, and so it's really just the voluntary support of listeners chipping in a few dollars here and there covers all of the costs associated with it. So thank you genuinely to people who do that, and if you have an extra couple of bucks to support public philosophy like this, then please consider chipping them in. It's patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. And to everyone who already sponsors, as well as people who just help support the channel by sharing on social media or recommending to friends or anything else that helps new listeners who might like this sort of content find it. Thank you so much. You are genuinely awesome. That actually wasn't a scripted moment. I had a martini in front of me and I reached for it and it just felt natural to toast the camera I was talking to. Whatever. Let's get straight to the show. Thank you to all of the sponsors and sharers, and I hope you find this topic as interesting as I have been recently. So, this is Leviticus with Professor Joel Baden. Okay, I am joined today by Professor Joel Baden. Professor, thank you so much for coming on the Political Philosophy podcast.
My pleasure.
So, just for people who might not be familiar with you or your work, what's like a short, potted introduction to what you do and what you like to write and study?
Yeah, my interest is primarily I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible, and my interest within that, which is a pretty big book, is primarily in the first 5 books, the Torah or the Pentateuch. And within that literary corpus, I'm largely interested in sort of literary questions. Why does the text look the way it does? How did it come to be? What's its compositional history? What can that tell us about sort of the various minds at work in ancient Israel and where these texts were composed, so it's not so dissimilar from studying the literature of any culture, really, because most of what I do has to do with sort of identifying the various threads and literary texts that sort of were combined to make up the Pentateuch as we have it. A lot of what I end up doing is sort of isolating and recognizing voices that often sort of aren't visible to the naked eye, and voices that are often very different from each other and from what we think of as like the Bible.
So I'm going to blame you for the topic I chose for this, which is Leviticus, because as I mentioned briefly before we came on, I found you because I was interested in sacrificial systems, and I found your Twitter, and then I found some of the talks you'd done. And anyway, I reached out to you. I asked if you could come on, do an episode on Leviticus. You kindly agreed. And so to do a bit of research, because this, not an area I'm super knowledgeable in, I watched a few other talks on it. Some, to be fair, coming from like the Christian tradition, and I realised that in religious studies, nobody likes Leviticus. And it all started with this sort of like, when the teacher's trying to convince you, it might not sound like it's going to be interesting, but it really is. Anyway, you sold me on the fact that it actually was interesting. So if my...
Though I also preface everything, every time I teach it or talk about it, I also preface it with, I know this is like hard to read and can be super boring, but...
Yeah. Someone put it might have been you, it might have been someone else I was listening to. Someone put it as, this is the part where people start skipping. And it sort of made me laugh, because I did think back to, like... God, I wasn't raised religious, but, like, at some point in, like, my teenage years, I figured, okay, let's give this thing a go. And actually, the Genesis, Exodus are quite, like, fast-paced. The story keeps moving. You can,
Mm-hmm.
And then you just suddenly get, now we're going to talk a lot and in detail about sacrifice and priests. And it's sort of like, oh, geez, where did all that come from?
Where does the story pick up again?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it feels like a sort of brutal sort of shock to jump into this material. And I'll say we say Leviticus, but that's like sort of quick code, because in fact that stuff, the terrible, hard to read stuff, starts in Exodus, where we have, there's like a dozen chapters. Exodus is a 40-chapter book. A dozen of those chapters are detailed blueprints for making like the sanctuary, the tabernacle, and then the actual making of it. So it's like it's brutally boring, and it's repetitive, because they say, here's how you do it, and then like word for word they do it, and then your eyes are already glazed over, and then you get to Leviticus and it's like, so what are we going to do with the blood now? And you're like, like when do they encounter, like when do they start moving again, and like where's the story pick up? But if we flip it on its head a little bit, if we think about it, the places where the story slows down are the places that the biblical authors cared about, right? Like the fact that they were like, yeah, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then like generation, and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that's great. Like I could do all of Abraham in like 6 chapters. That's fine. It's whatever. It's more than that. But Isaac gets like 3 chapters, and then they're in Egypt for like a couple, and then there's some plagues, and then it's fast paced, and then they're like, okay, but hold on, because I really need to go through this in detail.
Yeah.
That should tell us something. Like that should signal to us this is the thing that they thought was more important. That they were like, I can't go fast through this. Like we need to take this seriously.
I made the exact same point when I did a lecture series on Machiavelli, very different text. And I sort of said, everyone when they start with Machiavelli has like 3 quotes in their head from the Prince on issues he touches on like once, and then he's going to spend the whole back half of the discourses on like the minutiae of military strategy and like why some people are hardier soldiers than others.
Yeah.
And our eyes glaze over. We want the beloved not feared stuff, or feared not loved. But that's a pretty reliable key to like what is important to an author. Is like, what are they spending their time writing about?
Yeah, and I mean, we should recognize that, like in the history of interpretation and tradition, like we've reoriented what's more important. I mean, the amount of interpretive energy, especially in Christianity, that's given to texts like Adam and Eve, right, or the sacrifice of Isaac. These are texts that, if you look at the sweep of, especially as I said, sort of Christian interpretation, Christianity is clearly cares more about those, right, by the amount of space they give to it. But within the Bible itself, outside of the chapters about Adam and Eve, and outside of the half chapter about the sacrifice of Isaac, no one ever refers to any of those things again. Whereas I've got, 2 full books worth, basically, between the middle of Exodus to the middle of Numbers, that are just about this detailed priestly cultic stuff. There's just way more of it in the Bible itself, and way more care given to it.
Yeah. So maybe let's just put this in context. So I'm right in thinking that if you're approaching the Pentateuch, you're not looking at it like you would the New Testament, where you've got Luke and Paul and whatever, distinct works by distinct authors that are sort of self-contained units. The thing that we talk about the 5 books, but it's meant to be a continuous series, right?
Yeah. Right. The 5 books is a false distinction. It's 5 volumes of one book, right? There was never no one was like, and now I'm going to write a book of Exodus, right? They were writing this. They wrote this story that started back at creation potentially, and then they kept going, and it turned out that the thing that was produced, it's more complicated than this, but essentially the Pentateuch as produced was just materially too large to fit on a single scroll. So they divided it at like reasonable moments into 5 scrolls, and then we gave those scrolls names. And then they sort of took on a life of their own. So yeah, we're not talking about 5 distinct books. We are talking, as actually in the Gospels, about distinctive authors, though, but just not authors who are tied to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Those aren't different authors. What we have instead is it's as if somebody took the 4 Gospels and said, yeah, 4 stories of Jesus is nice, but what if I had one story of Jesus? And like took them all and combined them into one story,
right? Which,
for the record, happened.
Someone did.
Right. We have that text. It's from the 2nd century CE. It's called the Diatessaron. It's by a guy named Tatian. It's still a text that's used in Eastern Orthodox churches. So like that's the same principle basically applies to how the Pentateuch came to be, which is there were multiple histories of Israel's like early days from creation through the death of Moses. And someone was like, I don't need 4 of these. Like, I'll take one, and took the 4 excellent ones, or at least these 4, and smushed them together into one continuous story. But one that, as you read it, is full of weird bumps and contradictions that show us, right, that give us the evidence for there having been multiple authors at work.
So you have the creation of this thing is like the goal, or I guess you could deduce the goal through like redactive criticism, of to create a story that makes sense chronologically, but might not make sense in terms of like all the specific details and what have you within it.
Right. And it makes sense chronologically because that's how our brains and lives work, right? Like, time passes and things happen in order, and if they didn't, you wouldn't know how to understand it really. But it's so the chronology is an important aspect, right? Keeping everything in chronological order. But also, the other principle at work here seems to have been one of preservation. Whoever put these together really didn't want to cut stuff out of any of them. And how do I know that? Well, because it's still full of all the contradictions that show us that there were multiple authors at work. Somebody who was free to edit as they saw fit would probably not leave in, redundancies and problems and all these things. So, with a preservationist and chronological ordering sort of sensibility, you take these 4 things, you go, okay, I guess the one that starts in the beginning probably should come first, right? And then it just goes from there, right? What has to come next in all of these stories, and it just gets put together that way.
When I tell this story, and I'm not saying I know this is right or I even have the capacity to assess the claim, I always put the date of this, the editing together, not the original sources, as early Persian period, just after the exile. I mean, and not that I'm saying that's right. That's just the marker I have in my head.
Yeah, it's close enough. I mean, we don't have a precise date for it. We have a story in the Bible itself, right? We have the story of the figure of Ezra in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah that seems to describe something pretty close to this, right? Ezra's a scribe, familiar with the law, and he comes out from the exile back to Israel and says and reads this law book aloud to the people, and their reaction is all like, "Whoa, I didn't know that!" As if it was the first time they'd heard it. So that's a small piece of evidence that I'm not saying it was Ezra who did it, but there's a story that puts it in exactly the time period you're talking about. And there's evidence also within the Bible of texts like Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles, books that are from that early or mid-Persian period that seem to clearly be responding to the existence of not just the Pentateuch, but the existence of a Pentateuch that has contradictions in it that require solving. Your time period is basically there. Early, mid, late Persian period. It's in there somewhere.
Okay. So where are we at in the Composite Story? Well, let's just do the Composite one first, because I think pretty much everyone will be broadly familiar with the Genesis and Exodus stuff. But where are we at? Let's just start with that. Where are we at in the Composite Story when we start Leviticus?
Yeah. So we are, we have gotten out of Egypt. That was the book of Exodus, and we've made our way to the mountain Sinai in the wilderness. And all the stuff that we think of, all the cool stories that we think of at Sinai have happened. The Ten Commandments have been given, and laws have been given, and the golden calf has been built and destroyed. And so where we are is the moment is that now that by the end of Exodus, not only has all that happened, but the tabernacle, the structure that God gives Moses the blueprint for up on Sinai, has now finally been built. That's the very last thing that happens at the end of the book of Exodus. In Exodus 40, Moses builds the tabernacle, and in the very, very last moments of the book of Exodus, God comes and dwells in the tabernacle, right? The tabernacle, and you don't understand Leviticus without understanding this important principle, which is the tabernacle is God's house, right? It is the building in which God literally dwells, and it sits right in the middle of the Israelite camp, and so that's the last thing that's happened in Exodus is God has come down and taken up residence in his new home, the tabernacle.
So
that's where we are.
Would I be right? Well, would this do as a summary to sort of say, so far we've had a series of stories about God's relationship with the world and mankind, and at this point they're now moving in together. God is coming to live with one specific peoples. But in order to do that, he's going to have to lay down some house rules about how this relationship is going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, God gives up on all of mankind, right? Like pretty early in Genesis, right? It's not all mankind, but by the time we're 11 chapters into Genesis. By the time God's like, okay, I can't deal with everyone anymore, right? This isn't going to work. I'm going to just deal with this one people, and hopefully that'll, I don't know, like by osmosis, everybody, it'll work for everybody. So we've been just with the family of Abraham and the Israelites since Genesis 12. But yes, they've been, there's been sort of a familial relationship with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that's involved, I'll take care of you and I'll make promises to you and all these things. And now, and now God has said, okay, like you're a big people now, right? Totally multiplied in all the ways that you were supposed to. And I'm going to be bringing you through this wilderness into the land that I had promised. And I'm going to live among you now and then in the land also. And so first of all, I need to tell you exactly the kind of house I like. So we get all of these really detailed building instructions and blueprint stuff. So here's what I like my house to look like, please. Down to the very last peg and socket and, incredibly, it's just so painful. And so they build the house to its specifications. And now, just as you said, in Leviticus, God's like, okay, now here is how you keep my house clean. It's really the overarching issue for at least the first half of Leviticus is God's concerned about how you will make sure that God remains happy in his new home and in his home when it's not new anymore. And mostly it's how do you keep it clean, right? A house that gets too dirty, no one wants to live in. Um, so this is the primary aim of certainly the first 16 chapters or so of Leviticus.
Okay, so I want to pull apart all of that: the God living with you, the house, and the clean bit.
Yeah.
I have one more sort of source question. This is well, is it? Is this all P Leviticus, or is there other bits woven in there?
Good. So I know what P is, and you know what P is. Does
Yeah.
everybody else here know when we say, is this all P? That especially that one sounds funny. Um, uh, so right. So I said before, right, there are essentially four sources of the Pentateuch, and we refer to them all by.
I think what I'll do is I'll link to one of your previous interviews on the documentary hypothesis in like the show notes. So we can do
Terrific.
like a quick overview here, but then if
Ter-
people want to hear more, we can just sort of direct them that way.
Totally. In any case,
Yeah,
of
but
the
please.
of the four sources, the one we refer to as P is the one that it's called that stands for priestly, and it begins in Genesis 1, but it covers the entirety of Leviticus as well. So there's nothing non-priestly in Leviticus at all. It's all priestly writing from start to finish. There's none of the other sources of the four sources are in here.
That's kind of new though, right? Because Genesis and Exodus have been a whole sort of mishmash, like almost like sentence by sentence split from
Sometimes,
different texts.
it's new. It's not entirely new. When we get to Deuteronomy, we'll suddenly encounter a source that takes up 98% of that book. Um, uh, but again, we shouldn't think of it as like, oh, something strange or weird has happened here. It's just that the priestly storyline is actually very spotty through Genesis and Exodus. Um, it doesn't have many of the wonderful stories. There's no Adam and Eve. There's no sacrifice of Isaac. There's virtually no Joseph story in there. So like stuff that takes up big chunks of Genesis and Exodus, P is just is skipping through. It's like Reader's Digest notes. Like, yeah. Then Joseph went to Egypt, and then everyone else came down too. Anyway, but then when P gets to this part, it's got all the things to say because the canonical compiled text is ordered chronologically. If there comes a moment in one of the stories where, for a month at this mountain in the wilderness, God gives instructions about, that means that the whole canonical text has to stop there too. Right? There's nothing to interweave because there's no story that is taking place during this time. The next thing that's going to happen in all of the sources is Israel's going to leave Sinai.
Yeah.
So if P's got a whole book's worth of stuff to say, that's what we get here.
And presumably J or whatever doesn't. They don't have anything
No,
to
no,
throw
no.
in here.
Jay has very little to say, and what it had to say, it said already in Exodus.
So here's what I could, because there's like no place I can go and just read the priestly source, right? What would it look like? I mean,
So the answer as of this conversation is no. In about a year or so, I would guess the answer to that specific question about P will be yes. One of my colleagues, Leanne Feldman, who's at NYU, is in the process of publishing essentially a critical edition of P. So an English translation that will allow you to read the whole thing from start to finish. And it's a wonderful project that I think is going to make this difficult literature actually really like accessible and comprehensible in a way that it hasn't been. The other sources you could read. The D source is just Deuteronomy. You can read it. J and E are harder to come by. I hope at some point they'll be out there, whether by me or someone else. But yeah, it's they're a little tricky to find just isolated. The priestly one is coming now.
But so this is my question, because I can't. If I did read this future book, presumably like the intro into Leviticus wouldn't be that long, right? What would have been covered there? because we did the general composite intro. How, if I was reading the original reconstructed, whatever you want to call it, if I was reading the original, how might my perspective be different on nature of God or just the narrative details coming into this versus the one we're all familiar with, like that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I mean, what you would discover is just how quickly the text gets us to this point. Yeah, you're going to be missing tons of good stories that you're used to. But I mean, what you'd find is the creation of the world in Genesis 1. You'd find, a quick genealogy to get you to the flood. You get a flood story, not exactly the one that we have, right? That's a composite text also. But you get the priestly version of the flood story, and then you get some very quickly moving into Abraham. You get a little wait to talk about Abraham burying Sarah in chapter Genesis 23, and then it would really quite quickly just like move you almost in a genealogy, not quite, but like an annotated genealogy through the end of Genesis. Just little bits and pieces. You'd get the enslavement of Israel in Egypt in a handful of verses. You'd get P's version of the plague story and the Passover event in Exodus, which is a big deal, right? The moment of God taking Israel out. You'd get them crossing the Red Sea, much like in all the movies. And then, like, in a handful of verses later, they would, having crossed the sea, they would have arrived at Sinai, where God comes down on the mountain, and Moses goes up and gets the blueprint for the tabernacle, and here we are. I just did this the other day. I was thinking to myself, I was looking at the tabernacle construction stuff in Exodus, which is roughly 12 chapters worth. And I think that everything in P prior to the beginning of the tabernacle building instructions is only like 15 total chapters worth if you were to smush it all together. So in other words, it would, and that's, then you get 12 chapters of tabernacle, 27 chapters of Leviticus, 10 more chapters of Numbers. So it would feel like you had sort of really rushed through the story to get to this moment. And it would just be so much more apparent that this is what this author cared about and was really aiming at. And it's not surprising, right? If you're a priest, the moment of the building of God's house and the moment when God takes up residence in it, and then you as a priest, it's your job literally to maintain that. Of course, this is what you care about, right? Everything else is just backstory to get to this moment, which is the defining moment for, you asked about what we know about God's relationship with Israel. And the answer is not a ton. There will be some promises made in Genesis and some promises, sort of fulfilled in Exodus in terms of taking the people out. But even within the priestly material in Exodus, the tabernacle stuff, there's a moment when God says, I'm going to dwell among you, and you'll know that I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt in order that I might dwell among you. So like, this isn't something that sort of like just happened. This is the point. Right? The creation of the home, the indwelling of the deity among the Israelites, and then all of the rules about it. This is what everything was leading up to.
Here's one that confuses me, though. The tabernacle is a stand-in for the temple. No?
Yes. The tabernacle, yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no. I mean, certainly it's easy enough to think about this as the tabernacle is like a retrojection of the temple back into Israel's sort of mythical early history. Assume that the priests work in the temple and they want to establish the temple as having been commanded by God way back when Israel was in its formative years. Okay, so that obviously couldn't have been before the Exodus. It must have been in the wilderness. We must have, and what would it look like? Well, it had to be portable, so it's got to be more of a tent than, it can't be made out of stone. So they're sort of retroverting the temple into a portable tent sanctuary. So that much I think is accurate. I do think that there probably was something akin to a portable sanctuary space that existed in Israel prior to the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. I think it was probably one among many holy sites in Israel. But we even have stories about it elsewhere in the Bible, right? With the story of the Ark of the Covenant exists in something like a tent in the sanctuary at Shiloh, and David wants to bring it to Jerusalem, so he goes and he grabs it, and there's a whole story about the Ark, and it gets captured, So it's got its own identity, and my guess is that this priestly version of the tabernacle is something like a retro version of the temple mixed with memory of there having been, and the Ark of the Covenant. The P wouldn't call that. The Ark was a real thing, I think, right? It's not something that was invented, and it was really at the center of a cultic sacred space, and it almost certainly was in the temple for most of the temple's history, if not all of it. But I think it existed before that in some other form.
So it's a mixture of a retrojection and some sort of historical memory,
maybe. Yeah, which is not unusual. I mean,
and the context. In the context of, like, ancient Mesopotamian religion, God's moving around. Like, a God is in this place and then he's in the other place. That's pretty par for the course, I think, right?
Yeah, that's not weird in that context. And, of course, it rings weird to modern ears because we all sort of have grown up over 2,000 years with the notion of the omnipresent deity, right? Omnipresent and invisible and omniscient and omnipotent and all of these things that have nothing at all to do with ancient Israelite or Hebrew Bible views of the deity and its character, right? Those are all Neoplatonist ideas that entered into the picture at a later date.
So God is actually okay. So we did a bunch of like ground setting, but we've got our background. God is coming to live with the Israelites.
Right. The actual physical, deity is coming to live in an actual physical house. Right. It's not a metaphor, and it's not like it's not some this is what's being claimed, right? The actual deity who looks like and acts like a person but better, and has the shape of a person but probably better, is coming to live in a house like a house a person would live in, but the house is better.
Okay, so but like, here's one of the things that like both sort of blows my mind, but I just find so fascinating. Is like, what were they visualizing? Like, I always like. Were they visualizing like we do the resurrected Jesus? Like, yeah, he's a god, but like looks like a dude. He's a dude. He's in a dude's body. Or is it something like a bit more supercharged than that? Like,
so it's supercharged is probably good. There's a book literally just came out. At least it just came out in America. It's been out for a while in England. Called God and Anatomy by Francesca Stavrakopoulos, and was
she just on Digital Hammurabi?
Yeah, she was.
Yeah, I think I saw that interview.
I'm sure she
anyway,
was.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a great resource for learning about this notion of the sort of the shape of God. But yeah, when you read the Bible, there's all sorts of references to God's hands and feet, and God walks, and Moses sees God's back. And you can't see God. You're not allowed to see God face to face, except sometimes you do. Isaiah sees God sitting on a throne, wearing a robe, right? Like, how much more we could take all of them and be like, that's just that's just our way of talking. Doesn't have to do. Okay, but that's nonsense, right? Like, that itself is us trying to impose a later understanding of God onto text where clearly God was anthropomorphic. How size? I don't know. Like, did God have a beard? Probably. But was it well kept? I don't know. So the details are hard to come by. And of course, part of the claim of the text of the Bible almost everywhere is that, with a very few exceptions, no one can ever see God. So they're imagining God in clearly human form, but also recognizing that this is a deity that is, if not invisible, it's a deity that is not visible.
I'm not sure I understood the last distinction.
That is, you can't see God in the sense of you're not permitted to see.
Oh, okay, I see.
So he's not I think so much in the sense of God is by nature invisible.
So there really is something behind the curtain, but you're certainly not allowed to look back there.
Right, and in fact, and the curtain is a great. I don't know if you meant it literally or metaphorically, but of course, inside the tabernacle there is a curtain that separates God's inner chamber, where God says that in my inner chamber, that's where I'm going to sit, and that's where I'll talk to you, and that's where I'm going to be hanging out. And there's a curtain that divides that, so that the priests who work in the outer chamber never get to see behind it. And the only person who can ever go behind it is the high priest. And he can only go behind it every so often. And when he does, he's got to bring like incense and create smoke in front of him so that to shield him, right, from seeing God, and probably vice versa.
So if you're going to those lengths to avoid seeing God, it must be possible to see God, at least within this.
Yeah. Why? And we have not necessarily from the priestly source, but we have story after story upon story about people seeing God and it being amazing, right? Like, there are the lines like, no man can see me face to face except Moses, right? Or they looked upon God and miraculously they lived. Right, you get these occasional notes like this, which suggests, you can, but it's super dangerous.
Why? Why does it kill you if you look at God? That's the bit I've never understood. Because it's just sort of almost like assumed knowledge. You get this stuff, but make sure they don't look at me because they'll die. And Moses yes.
Okay, but you know why? That is it's the Wizard of Oz, right? Because if everyone in Israel is terrified at the possibility of seeing God, that means no one looks behind the curtain, because you and I know that when they look behind the curtain, they're not going to find anything, right? So that to me is in a sort of medicine. It's self-protection, right? It keeps people away from. It also keeps people outside, away from cultic spaces that could be, that the priests want to control. But it's basically the same phenomenon.
But this is because so much of this, and certainly the sacrificial systems, is like not that far away from anything else they might be doing in this sort of geopolitical ecosystem. The bit that's different is their gods are physical, but no, they're there, and it's this statue of Marduk or whatever.
Right.
Here it's there and it's physical, but it's not the same thing as this statue.
Yeah, that's right. The unique thing about Israel, one of the major unique things, there aren't really that many, but one of them certainly is this. Whereas, as you say, other surrounding cultures have their sanctuaries, have their temples, and have the deity physically, visibly present in it. In Mesopotamia, they bring it out and parade the statue around, and Israel's understanding, seemingly fairly widespread, was yes, the deity may be there, but we don't make statues of our deity because our deity is not to be represented that way. Now, this may simply, like so many of the other things, be like, here's how we're different from you. Right? It may be an identity formation kind of thing. Like we separate ourselves and distinguish ourselves from our neighbors by not doing the same thing that they do. But in any case, I don't have a great explanation for it as a phenomenon, but it does seem to be a pretty widespread biblical Israelite concept are God's really there and really is anthropomorphic and really is potentially visible, but we don't see that. We don't see our God, and we don't represent our God in that sort of very direct way that our other peoples do.
Okay, so to recap,
Do you think we're going to get to Leviticus today? I don't
I
know.
don't know. Let's get to Leviticus. I've got a Bible here. Okay, so we get to Leviticus. God moves in, and then he's going to lay down, let me go to the first chapter, what you need to do to keep him happy and keep him there. And we go straight to, if his offering is burnt from the herd, he shall offer a male, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get through all this. Can you summarise
Yeah.
the offerings? Like, before we get to the why, what is being requested that happen to keep God happy?
Sure. So we want to think about sacrifice in the priestly system, and remembering that what we're reading Leviticus is unique to the P source and its notion of how sacrifices work. There are two basic divisions of sacrifices. There are voluntary sacrifices and involuntary sacrifices. And the book starts with the first 3 chapters are voluntary sacrifices. You feel like you just want to make an offering. Just whenever the hell you feel like it, you say, you know what? I had a great week in the stock market. I'm going to sacrifice a cow. And thank Yahweh that way for having done so. Okay, here's how you do that. And this is so 3 chapters of you just want to do it. Terrific. Here's the rules for how you do it. And they involve the process, right? You have to put your hands on the animal to signify your ownership of it and the transference of ownership to the deity, and then it's killed, and then it's either cut up or it's not, and it's burned, and the various bits and pieces are put together. And say it's the kind of you could do a whole burnt offering where the whole animal gets burnt up, or you could do the kind where they cut up the animal and some of it gets burned on the altar, and the priests eat some of it, and you eat some of it. So it's like the party sacrifice, right? It's the family barbecue, and that's the kind that's offered like on festivals, right? You want to go have like a big to do, and you and your whole household go and you do this offering and you get all this meat back and then you cook it and everybody's hanging out and having a good time. Those are voluntary sacrifices. They're easy. They're ubiquitous. And I should say everybody out, including not just the priestly source, but everybody knows about those kinds of sacrifices. They're everywhere in the Bible, starting with Cain and Abel, who are the first ones to try and offer sacrifices, and on and on. Either a burnt offering or the one where you get to eat some. Those are the 2 categories everybody else in the Bible knows about. And then the priest author was like, but I have more sacrifices that are required, and these are the ones that really have to do. If the first set, the voluntary ones, have to do with like if you feel like making God happy, here's a nice way to do it. The involuntary sacrifices, which take up the next few chapters, are the ones that are really crucial for keeping God like in his home. And the sacrifices here come in a couple of different flavors. There's sacrifices for if you unintentionally violate some sort of ritual command. So you've made some sort of error. You've sinned, not in the broad Christian sense of sinning, but in a more specific sense. And so you need to bring a sacrifice for that. Or let's say, on the other hand, let's say that you, for another type of sacrifice, if you accidentally touch something sacred, right, and therefore sort of profane it with your not sacredness, you need to bring a different kind of sacrifice for that, though they're sort of conceptually related. And so they've sort of put in place a system that in theory requires sacrifice from Israelites more often than just whenever they feel like it. The key here for understanding how does any of that relate to God's house? And the answer is sometimes hard to get our heads around, but then you just need to make one little conceptual leap, which is in the priestly mind, when you sin, you've done something wrong. Like you've committed an act, but nothing about you personally has changed. You just screwed up, right? It's unintentionally, you didn't mean to, but like you accidentally, I don't know, like you accidentally did a little bit of work on the Sabbath because you forgot what day of the week it was.
Hmm.
Right? Like, okay, like you're bad. Like no one's angry at you. But the sin you've committed, that sin takes on like a sort of reality of its own, and the sin contaminates the sanctuary. It's like the sin is magnetically attracted to the sanctuary and like adheres to it. And sin is yucky, right? And so the sacrifice that you offer when you commit a sin is not to fix you. It's that the blood of the sacrificial animal gets collected and then sort of like sprinkled around the sanctuary to clean it. Blood, the great phrase that one of our, one of the great scholars of this created was blood in the priestly system is a ritual detergent. It's the thing that cleans up the dirty sanctuary. So when you sin, your sin contaminates the sanctuary. You make an offering, the priest sprinkled the blood, and your sin is cleaned up. This is true also, not just if you sin, but if you become impure, and there's a whole bunch of chapters in Leviticus about impurity and what generates it. If you become impure, your impurity also contaminates the tabernacle, if it's like a severe enough kind of impurity. And you need to do a sacrifice to get rid of that too. The impurity system is complicated. And I don't know how far down that rabbit hole we want to go, but there are things that are, there are things that are severe impurities that require sacrifices and like almost quarantining. And there are things that's like it's not a big deal, like just take a bath and you're good.
So let me summarize back to you to see if I understand, because this is like way different than
than any system that we have now or have ever really participated in. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a category of things called sins. These can go all the way up to murder or something, but all the way down to I forgot it was the Sabbath and I picked up some sticks. Right. There's also a thing called being pure and impure, and it's almost, sometimes one gets the feeling, a bit like having the cooties, in that if you touch something gross, you become impure, and you need to purify yourself. Here's the difference. That doesn't just affect you. Purity and sin build up in God's house. The house gets messy. God doesn't want to live there anymore. So if that's allowed to persist, God will leave and that will be bad.
Right.
So we have to, and there's no thought here of just don't ever sin or don't ever be impure, because you're never going to avoid it completely, especially with the impurity stuff.
Right.
You're going to just, it's inevitable that you will be impure some of the time. So it's inevitable. It's very like living in an actual house. There's never going to be a state where it gets so clean you never have to clean it again. It's just you continually have to just pick up after yourself.
Right. And to build on that, you're absolutely right. It's especially because when we talk about sin in this context, we're always, at this point at least, talking about unintentional sins. So it's not even like you couldn't avoid it if you wanted to. You didn't mean to do it in the first place, right? You forgot. Or you made a mistake, right? And then you went, oh God, it's Saturday. I'm not supposed to be picking up sticks. I've created sort of this metaphysical dirt that I now need to clean up. And impurity even more so, because you say impurity unavoidable, in large part because there are things that make you impure that are, I don't know, like required for life, right? Sex makes you impure. Burying someone makes you impure. Having a baby makes you impure, right? There's none of these things are wrong, right? Neither unintentional sins nor impurities have any moral valence to them whatsoever. They are totally normal parts of life. Virtually everyone would have been impure, and today virtually everyone is impure all the time. Being impure is totally cool. You can be impure. It's not a big deal. And again, the vast majority of impurities, like if when you have sex, right? If you have sex, you have the male is impure, right? Because genital emissions are always impurifying, but this is obviously a necessary one. So you have sex, you're impure. Oh my God, what do? Literally, you take a bath. And that's it, right? Like you don't have to do. There's no sacrifice needed, right? You take a bath. This is actually the requirement of bathing as a way of removing ritual impurity is a large part of why I mean that story explains why Jews got massacred after the Black Death in Europe because they didn't get affected as much because they were taking baths all the time for ritual reasons, so they had better hygiene, so they survived in greater numbers. And of all the Christians dying, we're like, how come they're surviving? I bet they started it and then killed all of us. Anyway, but
in contrast, there was an English king whose name escapes me, who was considered a very womanly figure because he bathed once every 6 weeks, whether he needed it or not.
Right. I can't imagine how you'd end up with a plague. So impurities and
that was Elizabeth. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Impurities and unintentional sins are totally normal and fine, and okay, so you just take care of it. So yeah, exactly as you said, the house is never going to be perfectly clean, but of course, within the system, there is also the recognition that over a bunch of time, the house analogy works so well, right? Like you can clean, I clean the house every day, I tidy stuff up and I put things away and I do the dishes. And after a while you start to notice, oh man, like underneath the couch is pretty gross. And like, what is that, gross thing that's like leaking out from the refrigerator? So you're like, okay, spring cleaning or fall cleaning, whatever it is, we're going to do the whole thing and we're going to like make it real good because it's not that I intentionally left that stuff. I didn't even know it was there.
And that's the Passover is ritual.
No, not Passover. That's Yom Kippur.
Oh, sorry. But okay.
That's
Yom Kippur.
In Leviticus 16. So you get
Passover's the sacrifice. Yeah. Sorry.
You get all these laws like here's the sins, here's the sacrifices, here's all the ways you can become impure, and then they're like, okay, once every so often though, you might just want to like essentially reset the whole thing to ground zero. And they talk about it in sort of hard to follow ways, but they talk about this major spring cleaning ritual as being is essentially resetting the sanctuary back to its factory settings. Like just like it was the day it was inaugurated, back when Moses first built it. And so yeah, it's a more involved ritual that involves more animals and more blood. And this is the moment where the high priest goes into the innermost chamber and doesn't go in there just for funsies, right? He goes in there so that he can put the ritual detergent blood in the innermost chamber, right? Like you got it. It's like pulling the refrigerator out and like, getting underneath there or pulling up the couch. You got to get into all the nooks and crannies and get any of those sins and impurities that have gotten in there. And so that's what that special day is for. It's the like, if I have to clean up from unintentional sins whenever I have them, I have to have known that I unintentionally sinned in order for that to happen, right? I have to be like, oh fuck, it's Saturday, I picked up twigs. But if I never occurred to me, like if that moment hadn't happened, I'd still picked up twigs on that Sabbath. And so my sin is still contaminating the sanctuary. So every so often we got to get in there and just clean the whole thing out.
It's a maintaining. This I found interesting because it did make me jump to metaphors. And one of them, it is literally like living with someone. Like if you're married, I think, I don't know, here's Toby's dating advice. But I think if you approached marriage with a sort of ethos of like an ideal, you need to have be in a perfect state of bliss all the time. That might not be the most useful way to think about it. Not all of your relationship, but part of the relationship is you're going to annoy each other from time to time. You are going to literally make a mess of the space you're in. It's not ideal, but just clean up after yourself. if you live with someone, you will develop just little de-escalation rituals. You will just develop rituals of just like picking up after yourself, and it's like it's just like not as either elevated or as awful as religious visions can seem to make it. It's like just pick up after yourself. Like that's sort of the bottom line.
Yeah, and to take that maybe further. Yeah, pick up after yourself. I mean, it's a lovely way of thinking about it, right? And that's what this is. God has come to live with us, and we need to make sure that we keep God happy by keeping the house clean. But when you think about that for a second, that's like a wild religious, like that's a wild theological sentiment. It's also it's a theology that's been like worked out in such unbelievable detail over the course of these books, of course of these chapters. The notion that the rationale for sacrifice is entirely to keep the deity happy and sort of present. The thing I love most about it, and the thing that I think makes it, despite it being impossible to read, once you figure it out, I think it is among the most meaningful sort of theological or conceptual sentiments in the entirety of the Bible. It's entirely community focused. That is, the deity's presence is in the midst of the community, and the deity's departure would be death and destruction for the community as a whole. So it's entirely communally focused in terms of its outcome. Its responsibility is entirely individual, right? It's why your little one sin is not like that one cup you left on the counter is not the thing that makes the house unlivable. But if we all left our plates out all the time, it would quickly become a pigsty. So if we all just do our job and take care of our own messes, we do something remarkable in terms of a community outcome. And what makes that even more the case in terms of the individual community nexus here is, unlike so much theology of types that I'm not going to name, but they're Christian, is right, where the focus is on individual salvation, like what do I do to ensure that I get into heaven? Right? This entire ritual system, despite the fact that you're the individual bringing the sacrifices, is totally uninterested in you and your individual fate.
Yeah.
Right? When you sin, it's not like, oh no, your character and like you've got to redeem yourself somehow. No one cares. Right? You made a mistake and you sinned, and nobody cares about the fate of your eternal soul. What we care about is, okay, what that meant is you made kind of a mess. Like, could you just please clean it up for us? Like, that's the whole extent of it. Right? Once you've cleaned up your mess, the text says, you're forgiven. Right? It's not you're forgiven because, right, like you've made amends in some moral ethical sense. You're forgiven because, in the same way that if my kid accidentally drops and breaks a plate, I'm like, that's not a big deal. Like, I'm not mad at you. Just clean it up. And when they clean it up, I'm like, cool. Yeah. But if they didn't clean it up, I'd be like, oh, like that's the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is you made a mess and you cleaned it up. It's not that you accidentally made a mess. That's the principle here, and I think that's like just a wonderful framework and a counterbalance to so much of how people, I don't know, understand the Bible and theology.
Just a different version of sin as well, because there are certain theologies, and I shan't name them, but they are Christian. And I don't think all Christianity, and I don't think early Christianity, this is how they thought about it, but like sin is like a permanent feature of yourself that there's something deeply wrong with you. And I watched, this is kind of on my mind bugging me now, because I'm around religious people all the time, but like it's about a specific, well, I will name it now, a specific sort of strain of like American born-again religion. That it's not that people have different views to me. I talk to people of all sorts of different religious and political views. There's something about like, don't talk to me in that tone of voice. Thank you. Like, account of sin. that I just don't particularly like. You're coming in with a pretty hard judgment about me right off the bat,
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think P has well, I don't know, but like my impression is it doesn't have a super elevated view of mankind either. But it's not like you specifically, Joel, are a shitty, awful person, and unless you pray in the way I say, you're never going to find peace in your life. It's much more like, dude, we all have to live together and get on together, and like, you got to pick up your stuff. Like, that's all it is. And that's the extent of my interest in you.
Right. And I mean, there's more to be said about this. We certainly only made our way halfway through Leviticus, and fine. But the priestly text here, at least in the first half of Leviticus, and the stuff we've been talking about, it's not really interested in morality at all, individual morality at all. It doesn't care. It's not about how good a person you are, and it's certainly not about being. There's no notion of being born as a sinner or being inherently sinful anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. But it is truly, like, it's so laser focused on the tabernacle and on God's house, right? Like, because why, like, you're not that important. That what's important is the community, right? The temple belongs to everyone, right? belongs to everyone. The priests are here to serve and represent everyone, right? The priests walk into the sanctuary with, stones on their breastplate and on their shoulders that have the names of the tribes of Israel on them. They are public servants, right? They're public servants representing us. Like, why would any Israelite, said this is P talking, right? Why would you think that anyone cares about your fate, right? Like, we're after something much, much bigger here, right? Everyone's fate is at play here. So, like, don't make this about you, right? This is about we all have to participate in this, and the better we all are at it, the better it'll, the more we are going to maintain this thing indefinitely.
Let's end with this. This is like an editorial statement on my part about like what the value of reading scripture is, which I don't necessarily see in an absolutely foundationally different camp to, say, reading Plato or something like that. But if anyone knows Leviticus today, they know it for the "thou shalt not lie with a man" verse. And I think, like, hopefully what I tried to bring out in this conversation is, like, never even mind that specific verse. I mean, I brought it up, so comment on it if you want to. But, like, if you're just taking a Bible and going, yeah, this bit here, that seems to validate modern conservatism, or this bit here, that seems to validate modern liberalism, and I'm just going through to just sort of find... And people do this with texts in the history of political thought all the time. Like, the worst take on Twitter a while back, there always is one, was Kant invented critical race theory, because, the critique of pure reason. And, like, okay, that's stupid, but it's also, that's not what that text is there for. The texts are a source of imagination, of political or moral imagination, in that they can just show you just a completely different conceptual framework for the world that might not be immediately useful to a partisan political struggle, but it's just kind of, like, interesting and cool to think about. That's my editorial statement.
Yeah, I rail regularly against the picking and choosing of verses and moments from the Bible from both sides, left and right, because in whether you are picking out the verse in Leviticus, the anti homosexuality verse in Leviticus, or you're picking out some the rare verse in the Bible that is good for liberal causes.
Condemnations of wealth.
Yeah, okay, so there's a few. I'm just saying the balance is firmly on the other side, but that's fine. Whichever one you're choosing, what you're saying is, like, picking, like, if I can find a verse in the Bible that justifies my perspective, like, that's a plus, right? Like, as if we ought to be finding things in the Bible to justify our contemporary political or moral or ethical positions, which is weird, because of course, and especially when one of the things I love about the kind of work that I do, and especially finding this stuff, reading Leviticus like this is no one reads this way. In part because it's been embedded in like the compiled combined Pentateuch for 2,500 years. So who's ever read it, period. But also because it's this stuff is really hard to read, and like it's a genre that we're just not used to. Who reads sacrificial ritual law and is like, and now I understand exactly the theology. Like we're just not trained to do it, or at least most people aren't. But the Bible is, of course, this incredibly diverse conversation among, as you said, various people with various political and theological imaginings. And you pick you pick almost any verse out of it, and I can show you another one that says something different.
And you miss the interesting stuff when you assume that there's a coherent narrative that like everything can be woven into like this one storyline that, wouldn't you know, it just happens to back up what your biases were going into it. But even just the assuming one storyline a bit, we do this in Christianity all the time. There's a story about what Jesus does for you that can seem like very just abstract and hard to work out what's going on. But if you ask, Paul, the historic Paul, what resurrection is, he has a specific story for you, and it's not the one they teach you in Sunday school. But it's you get to see much more specific and interesting visions when you drop the requirement that it all harmonise at the end of the day.
If you want everything, if you want the whole thing to say one thing, whatever that one thing is going to be incredibly banal.
Yes.
It'll be lowest common denominator kinds of perspectives, and that does no service either to the ancient minds who created the text, nor to those of us who have inherited it, nor to the very text itself, which is a text that encodes within it by its very structure multiple different interesting voices. For us to be like, you know what, I'm going to ignore the presence of all these interesting voices, and I'm just going to I'm going to reduce it all to one thing. Like it's not even the Bible anymore.
Should we leave it there?
Fine by me.
That was exactly an hour, so that was well timed. I mean, I'll throw it back to you in closing. Anything? I mean, there's the whole we didn't touch on H.
I mean, we didn't touch on a million things.
Right.
I don't care.
Any final thoughts, because the nominal topic is Leviticus. Any final closing thoughts on that you think are like super duper important that we didn't get to?
No, I mean, I think that it's totally good. I mean, there's a million things to say. Mm-hmm. There's little details. There's bigger things. Again, we didn't talk about the second half of Leviticus at all, which is an entirely, as you know, like a slightly different version of the whole thing that expands on the ideas that we did talk about in really interesting ways that are actually more morally and ethically focused. But there's so much to talk about. You can't talk about it all. And it's okay. I'd much rather we talk about the things that we find mutually interesting and fun, and leave people wanting more.
I think that's a good thought. All right, let people know if they want to follow you on Twitter or direct them to a website or anything like that, where they should go.
My Twitter feed is just at Joel Baden, my name. That's the place to find me, and through there you can get links to. You'll find me doing my near verse by verse commentary on the entirety of the Pentateuch, and all sorts of other fun stuff too. I'm sure if you dig deep enough. Otherwise, I've got what feels like now 1 million podcasts and talks and stuff available on the internet, and you can set those up for people to find if you've got them.
I'll link to a couple of your stuff, and people should follow you on Twitter, because what Joel does is he just goes through and takes a few. You've gone through from Genesis through to we're in Numbers now, right?
I am. I'm in Numbers 3.
And just takes a few verses and just talks about historical context or anything like that, or how to read these. And it's just
whatever I find interesting in I'm doing.
But it's worth a follow. Anyway, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.